I don't want to assume that anyone has seen, that everyone here has seen the doctrine of R2P written down, or more or less what it means. So I would like to start my presentation by showing the 2005 UN World Summit outcome by United Nations high-level plenary diplomats that came up with this definition at the time. 2005. We declare clear and unambiguous acceptance by all governments of the collective international responsibility to protect populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. And we declare willingness to take timely and decisive collective action for this purpose through the Security Council, when peaceful means prove inadequate and national authorities are manifestly failing to do it. Now, in order to address the role that civil society and NGOs play in preventing mass atrocities, I want to first give you a quick overview about the current state of civil and political freedom in the world. In other words, let's see how these populations that are supposed to be protected through the responsibility to protect live, under what type of governments do they live. And what we find is that taking Freedom House's Freedom in the World Index as a parameter, what we find is that 45% of the world's countries are fully democratic or free. Only 45%. Of the remaining 55%, 24 are considered not free. These are those in purple, are considered not free, which means they are either what they call fully authoritarian countries, dictatorships, autocracies, however you want to call them. The remaining 31% of the world's nations are labeled as partly free, which would include such regimes as competitive authoritarian regimes or illiberal democracies like Venezuela or Thailand, for example, or countries where widespread civil rights violations occur as an indirect consequence of democratic government policy. For example, Mexico's war on drugs that leads to Mexico being considered a partly free country instead of a free country, although they elect their government democratically. In practical terms, what this means is that 55% of the countries in the world, 55% of the countries sitting at the UN General Assembly are non-democracies. In terms of human beings, this means 3.9 billion people living under non-democracies. 57% of the world's population living under non-democracies. Why do I make this introduction? Because from the perspective of the responsibility to protect, these numbers are telling. On the one hand, this means that 57% of the world's people live under governments they will have to somehow change or overthrow first before their voices are represented in a governmental body, before they earn the right to elect a democratic government to live in a democratic way. This also means that 55% of the governments that craft the very definition and policy alternatives around R2P, what we were discussing just now, and that decide when and how these premises will act, feel really no responsibility to protect. To the contrary, many times these very countries feel a great urge to harm a great portion of their people, like we saw in the Sudan and Darfur examples that we just went over. Let's remember that under dictatorships, under fully authoritarian regimes, people who oppose the government are inevitably considered enemies of the state. Enemies. This is precisely one of the main reasons behind mass atrocities, and it's one of the main reasons behind the emergence of the R2P doctrine. The early origins of the R2P can be traced back to the international community's failure to respond to the genocides in Rwanda and later prevent atrocities in Bosnia, such as the genocide in Srebrenica, which was mentioned earlier this morning and today as well, in the afternoon session as well as in Kosovo. As the consequences of those failures became apparent, rethinking the international legal rules addressing sovereignty and the duties of states began to shift both in the academic world as well as in policy communities. Now, there has been some progress. But in view of the amount of non-democracies sitting at the UN, how can we explain then the accomplishments that have been made? Well, to a great extent, the 2005 World Summit outcome document, which I showed at the beginning, is the consequence of leadership from the world's democratic governments in collaboration with civil society leaders in those same democratic countries, or under the pressure of civil society leaders, NGOs, in those same democratic countries, who have voiced their legitimate concerns in their free societies that allow them to voice their legitimate concerns that put pressures on their governments, which is what sadly doesn't happen in North Korea or in Syria, and which makes a difference between a closed society and an open society. It's not so much the virtue of the governments, but it's the space for a voice that the people have under those societies. This is something that must be recognized. On the government side, this leadership has included, for example, the Canadian government-appointed International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, which published the first R2P report in 2001. The important work of UN Secretary Generals Kofi Annan in 2005 and today's Ban Ki-moon, who voiced at their time and with their defects their concerns and put these issues in the global agenda. At least putting them into agenda is one of the things that have led to the advancements in these areas. In spite, and this must be remembered at all times, of the adverse context of having a majority of non-democratic governments sitting at the UN. And finally, the resolve, in the case of Libya at least, where the R2P doctrine was implemented, the resolve of the three democracies with veto power at the UN Security Council, the US, the UK, and France, which for Libya got approval from China and Russia, but that clearly it's those three governments in the UN Security Council that push, at least in different degrees, but that push for the application of the R2P doctrine. Thanks mainly to this leadership, the responsibility to protect is sufficiently grounded now on existing international law, although it has not yet emerged as binding international law, as we know, because it's not stipulated in a treaty. In 2001, HRF, the organization I'm honored to represent, had the honor to co-sponsor one very important collaborative book on the responsibility to protect by human rights attorneys Jared Ganser and Irwin Cutler, a famous Canadian human rights lawyer who was behind all these efforts that I just mentioned in developing this doctrine, and which I'll paraphrase a little as I go on with my speech. While the small NGO I represent has participated in this very small way in developing at least a little bit the responsibility to protect discussion, civil society organizations in free countries have played a fundamental role in the development of the R2P doctrine. For example, the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, which shaped the legal principles of the R2P doctrine, based a great part of its work on the consultations made to NGOs, academic leaders, universities, think tanks, and regional and international networks. The voices of both the democratic governments at the UN and civil society leaders in favor of R2P are no other than the voices of outrage of the free human beings living in those democratic countries. Again, it's not so much the virtue of the government, is the pressure from civil society, from NGOs. The voices of millions of non-coerced individuals that chose to read Elie Wiesel's Night and Gilbert Tuhoboni's This Voice in My Heart. The voices of millions of non-coerced individuals that chose to watch Schindler's List and Hotel Rwanda. The voices of millions of non-coerced individuals whose hearts wrenched as they watched the YouTube clip of Neda Aga Sultan shot to the ground in Iran as she expressed outrage at the rigging of elections by a dictatorial government. The voices of millions of non-coerced individuals whose hearts wrenched as they saw innocent civilians in Libya for months crying out for help through cell phone recordings. So, while it is good news that democratic governments have given the first steps in creating this R2P doctrine, at least in the books and with limited application, it is instrumental that going forward, civil society all over the world continue to play the role of close watchdogs for the timely implementation of the doctrine and continue to pressure the governments into strengthening acceptance of R2P norms at the international level. It is imperative that civil society organizations such as the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy keep raising awareness of this issue and promote dialogue among all stakeholders. What you're doing with this type of events is amazing, and it's in the right direction. The R2P doctrine is not an end in itself. It is merely a tool to ensure that governments act in a timely fashion to prevent mass atrocities. It is primarily civil society organizations that must call on their governments when crises are at the threshold of becoming genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, mass atrocities. Today, civil society, for example, has a formidable challenge ahead. As we speak, mass atrocities are being committed in Syria. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, nearly 70,000 people have been killed in Syria since unrest began in the country for more than 2 years now. Let's note that in Libya, what prompted action by the UN Security Council and NATO was 30,000 people killed. Syria is by 70,000 now and counting. And to show a very clear example of how dictatorships operate, this cartoon you're watching was drawn by the famous cartoonist Ali Ferzat, who my organization had the honor of giving a prize a couple of weeks ago called the Havel Prize for Creative Dissent. Of course, this depicts him trying to hitchhike with Gaddafi as the genocide was, the mass atrocities were going on in Syria. This is what happened to Ali Ferzat days after he drew this cartoon. Government people took him, beat him, broke both his hands, left him like that. He survived. But this is how dictatorships operate. There's no such thing as civil society gathering in this type of events. People who oppose the government, even through a cartoon. This is not being belligerent or anything. This is through a cartoon. That's the way they get retaliated against. We must bear in mind then that this is only incidentally a world of governments. This is fundamentally a world of human beings. If all human beings lived under democratic, transparent democracies, there would be no need for war, there would be no need for R2P. People would trade, text, commerce, Facebook friend, or debate each other on Twitter. No need to kill anybody, no need to invade, to occupy, to intervene, to liberate. I want to end my intervention with a quote of the core principles of the report made in 2001, groundbreaking report by the International Commission, again, on Intervention and State Sovereignty, that lays out nicely the doctrine and the implications on international law. State sovereignty implies responsibility, and the primary responsibility is the protection of its own population. Where a population is suffering serious harm as a result of internal war, insurgency, repression, or state failure, and the state in question is unwilling or unable to halt or avert it, the principle of non-intervention yields to the international responsibility to protect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was very interesting, very informative, very vivid, very nice. Your time for one or two questions. Yes, Dr. Stanton.
I just wanted to congratulate you. It's a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
What's very interesting about this doctrine, which of course was actually invented by Francis Deng, you know, he was the first author to propose this doctrine, 20 years ago. In his book about it, he said this is actually nothing but a restoration of the proper hierarchy of where rights come from. It goes all the way back to the Enlightenment and to the French Revolution and to the American Revolution, and both said the rights come from the people. It's not from God. The rights don't come from some dictator or some state. And this is, of course, exactly what has been said here, and that is that the people are the possessors of the right, and if the government doesn't protect those rights, it ought to be, the international community has a duty to intervene. So I just wanted, you did this so clearly, I just thought it was a terrific job.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Actually, in the same spirit, the charter of the UN Charter that promotes, the UN is supposed to promote human rights and also to act, the UN Security Council to act in order to promote international peace. These are the same principles under which this doctrine is based. So even legally, the base is very, very sound and solid, I think.
I'm so worried with term sovereignty. Was to me it implies it has become a guidance or an instrument to be used as to subvert the wills of the people by individuals in the state, claiming to the leadership as if they are the rightful people or owners of the very land. Because that is where all these things are coming from in terms of the genocide. And because people claim that this is a sovereignty. And as soon as people say sovereignty, every other progressive or so organizations start to withdraw and to halt any other help that they can. I don't know what exactly can be done in terms of the legal position around this, the issue of the state sovereignty, which has become a menace in this world.
I'm going to say two quick things about that. As to its practical application, I would take this enunciation of the principle as a guide. And it says the principle of non-intervention when mass atrocities are happening yields to the international responsibility to protect. The principle of non-intervention being a direct consequence of the notion of sovereignty in the way the world was organized after the Westphalian Treaty, and which reflects the world as we have it today after post-colonialism. Now, definitely the notion of sovereignty, to the extent that Sovereignty means over everything, supra everything. So the notion of sovereignty is from the 1600s, and it was devised by John Bodin, whose whose boss was the Prince of France, if I'm not mistaken, at the time, and he wanted to give him power over all the other powers in the area, and this is the Middle Ages, still, and the powers were the lords, were the church, the two churches. I mean, there was, even in the Middle Ages, there was some, theoretically, no one had claimed that was above everything. I mean, besides, of course, the religious notions that God is above everything. So this notion of sovereignty, which interestingly evolved theoretically, it was created at the same time where the notions of natural rights and civil rights were being created as well. Locke, Montesquieu never used the word sovereign. It was revived by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and unfortunately was incorporated as a very important principle of international relations. This is given legally the power of governments to declare themselves, to create totalitarianisms in the 20th century, something that was hard to do, not because there weren't evil people back in the day, but it was harder to do in the Middle Ages, to the extent that there were powers, different armies, people. There were a little bit of more checks and balances, if you will. So yeah, definitely the concept is very dangerous. It's something to be analyzed by legal philosophers or people of this.
Great. Well, on that note, I'd like to express our gratitude for you having made the journey to come here to Berlin. We're honored to have you at the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, and I think we're all very grateful for your perspectives. And also with you, we're very hopeful that we can collaborate in the future.
Thank you, Mark.
So if we could all please join in expressing our sincere gratitude to Javier El-Hage. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.